Let's first define our terms. So how do you define civil war versus domestic conflict and other terms here, just so that people understand what we're talking about, what constitutes it? And then would love to go into what are the components, the generators, the drivers that push us in that direction.
Yeah, civil war is actually an umbrella term for all sorts of different types of domestic political violence. So if there's a coup that actually is fairly violent and kills a number of people, coups come under civil war. Those are the smallest, least violent, but it goes all the way to social revolution. And then there's all sorts of stuff in the middle, including insurgencies. So civil war, is the way we defined it, is really very simple. You can have a major civil war, you can have a minor civil war. The major civil wars are conflicts that are fought between at least one group in society against the central government, and that produces a total of 1,000 deaths in the course of the war, and at least 100 deaths per year. So minor armed conflicts, which I don't study, and they didn't inform this book, they only have to produce 25 deaths a year, which to me that's a different phenomenon. So that's the definition. What's different about the wars today? A typical 21st century civil war is an insurgency. It's decentralized. It's not going to be fought by this, an organized large rebel group that's meeting, the government forces on a battlefield where both sides are wearing uniforms and they have a very clear chain of command. That's just not how the vast majority of civil wars today are fought. They tend to be very decentralized, where you have, multiple and sometimes hundreds of small factions, militias, paramilitary groups that are operating all over a country. Sometimes they're coordinating their activities and sometimes they're not. This is what happened in Syria. This is what happened in Iraq. This is what happened in Afghanistan. And they don't want to engage the government directly. And that's because the government and its military is almost always much, much stronger than these groups. So they prefer to avoid direct engagement and instead use non-conventional tactics like terrorism and guerrilla warfare to try to sort of get at the soft underbelly of these countries. That's the type of modern 21st century civil war that we see around the world and that we would almost certainly see here.
So I think from here, maybe it would be good to jump into what are the generator functions, the risk factors that give rise to civil war. Reading through your book, I certainly was under the misconception that, inequality. When inequality gets above a certain range, then you're going to get civil war. Or maybe it's poverty that is the leading indicator for when civil war is going to break out. And that turns out not to be the case.
So, I was on this task force called the Political Instability Task Force from 2017 to the end of 2021. And our goal was to put together this predictive model about where around the world civil war was likely to break out. And when the model was created, it was created by a room filled with people. And half the room were experts on civil war and half the room were data analysts. And the data analysts were there basically just to mine the information from the Civil War experts. And what they wanted to know is, okay, tell us what all the studies out there say about what could potentially be important. Just tell us about all the quantitative studies. What were the variables that were significant? And it turns out that there were over 30 different variables that were discussed and that the data analysts played with to try to determine what the best model was going to be. And that did include things like poverty, income inequality, how ethnically and religiously diverse a country was, how big the country was, just geographically. What was the size of a country? Did it have lots of rough terrain that would make it easy for rebels to hide? Did it have a really big population or a small population? So all of these factors were discussed, and it turns out that of of all of these variables, two were incredibly important. The model actually ended up having four variables and only four variables, but two were by far the most important. And the first one was this thing called anocracy. Political scientists have been talking about anocracy for decades. But it turned out to be really important in predicting which countries were going to experience violence. And anocracy is just a fancy term for partial democracy. It's governments that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. There's something in between. And in particular, it was certain types of partial democracies that were really at risk. And it was partial democracies whose elections were free but not entirely fair. So there was something about elections where one group in society or a number of groups in society really saw that they were not allowed to compete equally with other groups. And then the second factor that was really important in the model was this thing we called ethnic factionalism. And ethnic factionalism was when citizens in a country began to organize politically, not around ideology. So they didn't form a socialist party and a liberal party or, whatever it was around a particular set of political issues, but they formed their parties around identity. Either you had, ethnically based, religiously based, or racially based parties. And it was this combination, countries that were, whose governments were anocracies, but whose political parties were also ethnically, religiously, or racially based. Those were the ones that were at highest risk of civil war. And you also saw this ethnic factionalism in Northern Ireland, where the political parties in Northern Ireland divided exactly along religious lines. If you were Catholic, you voted for the Catholic Party. You would never, ever shift and vote for the Protestant Party. And the same was true if you were Protestant. So there was nowhere for you to go as a voter except for your own religious party. And then Northern Ireland also had this feature that I call super factions. That's particularly combustible. And that's where citizens not only divide themselves along identity, but they also divide themselves along religion and along geography. So, in Northern Ireland, you had Irish Catholics who tended to be more rural. I think they were more rural, fighting against the Protestants who had their own super faction. And of course, you see that here in the United States as well, where the Republican Party is 90% white. It's heavily evangelical Christian in a multi-religious country, and most of its voters live in deeply rural areas.
One of the things I think your book points out is there's a study from the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance that in 2021 found that for the fifth consecutive year, the number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction exceeded the number of countries moving in a democratic direction, and not just by a little bit. I think there are 3x more moving towards authoritarian than democracy, which means that now 25% of the world's population lives in a backsliding democracy. And as you sort of look around the world and you realize it's not that we're in this gray zone between democracy and authoritarianism. We're in the red zone between democracy and authoritarianism.